So there had been a couple of requests to do this, so I put together a whole multimedia thing here. And I'm primarily going to focus on the rules that affect us on the water. And there's a lot of rules that. Oh, here's Harry Flockhart. There's a lot of rules that, in fact, the bulk of the rules actually don't have anything to do with our kind of racing or even us, but have to do with the race committee and protests and all that kind of stuff. So I'll just mention that as I go through, but mostly I'm going to focus on the water stuff. Now, let me know if you see my slide advance. There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so the original basis of the racing rules of sailing come actually out of the 72 coal regs. The first few rules are straight out of the book, just about, very close, which are the collisions at sea navigation rules, which are international and honored by the US and the Coast Guard. Just for people's knowledge, I thought I'd point this out, that if your boat is greater than 39.4 feet, you're actually supposed to have a copy of this on board your boat. So if you're a 40-footer, you're actually supposed to have a copy of that document right there on board. And it doesn't really say it has to be printed, it just says for handy, reference, so it could be electronic. But of course, the rules that we race under before coal regs was kind of codified and made international, it's been around probably since the first two guys floating on logs bumped into each other. So it's been, around for forever. One of the things I wanted to focus on, which is kind of key, I found, is how to read the racing rules of sailing. This screen's in my way here. And talk a little bit about the structure. You'll notice that the current racing rules of sailing are for 2017 to 2020. The reason for that is they publish them every 4 years. Right after the Olympics, they publish a new one so that everybody racing for the Olympics will have been racing under the same set of rules for 4 years before the Olympics happen. And I was just told that they are not going to push these set of rules out for the Olympics because they've been delayed. They're going to come up with a 2021 set of rules next year. We'll see what happens. But these are all codified by the World Sailing Organization, which a few years ago was known as ISAF, but they renamed themselves. So if you remember ISAF, they renamed themselves to World Sailing, and US Sailing subscribes to World Sailing's principles and rules. So US Sailing is authorized under World Sailing, and then racing programs and organizations can be authorized by US Sailing here in the United States. So that's kind of how it's all organized, and that's the racing rules that we race under. Now, a couple of things about how to read these rules. First, the whole book is treated as the rules. Everything, basically cover to cover, is part of the rules. It includes the introduction, terminology, and especially definitions. And I'll get into the definitions section in a little bit because it's really important to know what the definition of something is when you're reading a rule. It matters a lot. It includes that you have to adhere to all the Coast Guard regulations, so safety and all that. When you're reading the rule, the definitions are in italics. You'll see them in italics in the rules, and that means they're using a word that comes from the definitions at the beginning of the book, and I'll go through that a little bit. Some of the rules apply to us racers, others apply to the race committee and on how to structure a race, etc., and a few apply to both. I'll be focusing mostly on the ones that apply to the racers here. And also some rules modify other rules. So some rules will say, if this applies, then these rules don't apply, and things like that. So it gets a little tricky, and again, I'll go through some examples. And there are some gray areas. One of my pet peeves is there isn't actually a definition for a boat. Seems odd, but sometimes they're very clear on what they mean. The hull or boat and crew and equipment. Sometimes they're not, but there is an addendum, and I'll show it to you at the end of this. There's a separate book called the case book, and it has a whole bunch of cases that help sort out gray areas, and you can fall back to the case book if there's some weird gray area on a penalty or something. So this is straight out of the definitions, and that is the definition of a rule, straight out of the definitions in the book. So it includes everything. It also, I'll point out, it includes the preambles to sections. So if you're reading a section that has rules in it, you gotta read the preamble at the beginning, because it may say applies here and doesn't apply here for the entire section. And I'll show you some examples of that. A lot of this stuff, you'll see it references anti-doping code, so watch your drug dealing on board. Betting, no, you can't be betting on who's going to win the race. Things like that. Prescriptions for the national authority. U.S. sailing, they're allowed to modify the rules a little bit, and U.S. sailing didn't really modify the rules much. They clarified betting, I think. It's nothing that affects the actual sailing rules on the water. And class rules, it specifies that a class rule, so some dinghy racing, 420s for example, might have their own class rules, so those would apply if specified in the sailing instructions for a class. Also, the notice of race and the sailing instructions, those are part of the rules. So the sailing instructions are allowed to modify rules in certain cases. And there's rules for how the sailing instructions can modify rules, but those really apply to the race committee. And any other documents that might apply. It's broken into parts. Part one, I'll skip over real quick because it's mainly safety and sportsmanship. That's no betting, anti-doping, safe sailing, good sportsmanship, stuff like that. The biggest part I'm going to focus on is part two, which is when boats meet. So that's everything from the start to the finish and going around marks and some of those things. The conduct of the race, that includes the start sequence, time limits. It also has stuff in there for the race committee on how to run the race, but it includes all of the details about flags and stuff like that. And I'll just skim over part four, although you should read it. It's the other requirements when racing. That's equipment rules. What defines a spinnaker versus code 0 jib? Why is one a spinnaker and why is one a jib? And some of those. And I'll go over the main ones that might affect our kind of fleet racing. But you would want to look that over. And I'll just mention, usually what I do is at the beginning of the season, just before we go racing, I go through the RRS and I read them just to bring myself back up to speed. The missed parts are things like how to handle protests. These really don't apply, on the water. So protests, hearings, misconduct, setting up a race organization. Those aren't the on the water ones. They're good to know about, but none of those are going to affect us during a race. So I'm not going to go into those. The rest of the RRS has appendices, and they include like the scoring system we use, the low point system, time on distance, all these other kinds of racing that doesn't really apply to us. Unless we do match racing or windsurfing, etc. Again, a lot of stuff for the race committee, actual templates for a notice of race and sailing instructions, how to set up a course and how to hold a hearing, all that. And the race signal flags. In the PDF that I sent there at the beginning of the document, in the books that are published, they're in the back pages. And the race signals and what their purpose is, that is part of the rules. It is in the book. It's all part of the rules. So there I'm showing our standard prep flag. That's P for Papa at the top, and the AP flag, or sometimes called the cat in the hat flag, underneath it. Okay, so just a few things. So before you head out to race, you should have read the sailing instructions, because again, the sailing instructions can modify the rules. They can change the start sequence. They can specify, a time of race expiration. There's a number of things that the sailing instructions are allowed to change for a race or a regatta. So make sure you read the sailing instructions. Check for signals ashore. The race committee may see storms coming in or something and may be delaying the race, and they may post a postponement or cancel a race on signals ashore. I'll get into that a little bit later. And of course, check the weather. Not really a rule thing, but safety is one of the rules. And the decision to race is the skipper's alone. It's not the race committees, it's the skipper's, whether he's going out there or not. So you're responsible for the safety. We encourage our race committees to keep an eye on radar and stuff if there's something threatening, and keep us posted. But ultimately, it's the skipper's responsibility according to the rules. For Port Jeff Yacht Club, we do not use the radio to check in. I think most of you guys know this. You sail by the committee boat and you hail the committee boat. So that's before we race. Racing, I'll get into a little bit more of that in a bit. But just a point of, and I'll repeat this a couple of times, if you are intending to race, and that's rule 24.1 there in red, if reasonably possible, if you are intending to race, you may not be racing yet, but you've got to stay out of the way of boats that are racing. So that means stay clear of, the starting line if another division in front of you is getting ready to start, etc. And for Port Jeff Yacht Club, we coordinate our races on VHF 72. Now, the race committee is supposed to fly flags if there has been certain changes, but let's face it, the distance and sometimes the lighting, especially late in the season, you can't see those flags all that well. So they'll sound a horn, but they'll announce whatever the change is on the radio so that people can hear. But technically, it's the flags that matter. I'm just going to do this real quick. This is kind of out of order, but protests and penalties, just to get it out of the way. If you are protesting another boat because you think they broke a rule which may or may not have affected your outcome in the race, it's fly a red flag, hail them at their earliest possibility, and let them know that you're protesting them. I don't know, you see their boom bump into a mark or something, and notify the race committee within 2 hours after the race finishes. Unless otherwise stated in the sailing instructions, we don't change that. That's the same rule we use for this under Rule 61. You shouldn't really protest somebody unless it's really clear and the race outcome might be affected. So they hit a mark. Now they should take a turn. I'll get into penalties later, but they should take a turn. If they don't, and you saw them hit the mark, protest them, because they should be pushed back in the sequence of boats by having to do a turn. But if it's just not going to affect the outcome of the race and nothing was really serious, we don't want to get into a protest situation, but you do have a right to do it for any reason. If you actually see or are affected by somebody breaking a rule. The other recommendation, and this is really a recommendation, is if you have been protested, unless you're really, really clear that you're right and they're wrong, you should take your penalty. And the reason for that is, if you fail to take a penalty, it is likely what's called a DNE, a disqualification not excludable. That means that if you're racing in a series of races, the scoring for that disqualification, which is one more than the number of boats racing, it cannot be excluded. Like if your series, we knock out the bottom half of the races in the scoring, that score cannot be excluded. So sometimes it's safer, if it's a gray area, to take the penalty than risk going before a race committee and getting disqualified with a DNE.
You would just do like a 360 and go around the mark again?
Yeah, yeah. Well, no, you don't even have to do that. I'll get into those. I'll get into some of the details of the rules here. So a summary, which you can just use kind of for general, and I'll repeat this summary later, and we'll get into the rules behind all these in a moment here. But port and starboard. Starboard has right away, over port, overlap, clear ahead, clear astern, windward, leeward, if overlapped, and I'll get into all of these. The zone at a mark is 3 boat lengths. The zone rules do not apply on the final approach to the start. Positions when the first boat reaches the zone is what sets the rights at a mark. And avoid tacking in a zone. It's not a hard rule, but we'll get into some of that, the nasty Rule 18 stuff in a minute. And avoid boats that are racing if you are not racing, and my personal favorite, no crashing. So that's Rule 14, actually. There's a rule for that. So that's yeah. Okay, so part 2. So part 2 is when boats meet, which of course is the most kind of complex, significant situation that we run into on the water. Here's an example of that preamble. Remember I said to read the preamble. These apply between boats that are near the racing area and intending to race, are racing, or have been racing. So if you are still heading out to the race area, these rules all apply to you. If you are done racing and you've cracked your beer open and you're heading back in, these rules apply to you. So you have to follow these rules from end to end, almost from mooring back to the mooring. There are a few exceptions, and we'll get into those in a minute. So right of way. Right of way is the biggest one by far. And just as the simple case, and everybody knows this because it's not just a racing rule, it's a Colregs rule, it's just general rule that, you know, a starboard tack boat has right of way over a port tack boat. One interesting thing, by the way, just a note on history here. The word port used to be over in Europe called larboard, and that actually comes from Old English, which was larboard, which means the loading side of the boat. So it was the side that was up against the port for loading. And starboard, a lot of people think that it means it's the star side that looks out into the stars, but actually it comes from starboard, Old English, when the boats had steering boards as rudders slung to the side of the boat. So the steering board side was away from the pier that they'd come up to for loading, so it wouldn't get damaged. So you have the steering board side of the boat and the loading side of the boat. The problem was the British Admiralty found that larboard and starboard in wind and waves and across a big deck would sometimes get confused. So the British Admiralty said, forget larboard, we're calling it port because it's the port side and you can hear it better, and that's port, where port and starboard come from. But this is an example of where there are, Rule 10 is just those couple of things at the top. When boats are on opposite tacks, you know, port tack shall keep clear of a starboard tack boat. That's the whole rule. But tacks, port tack, keep clear, and starboard tack are in italics. So you got to go to the definitions. And it gets really interesting. A boat is on tack starboard or port corresponding to her windward side. Windward's in italics. You go to windward, it says see leeward and windward. So you go to leeward and windward, and it says a boat's leeward side is the side that is, or when she is head to wind, was away from the wind. That's a subtle clarification there. If a boat turned from starboard and is tacking over onto port, and she's head to wind, maybe in irons or something, she's on port tack because she came from starboard, now is head to wind. I mean, she's still on starboard tack, so she came from starboard, turned head to wind, still on the tack. Now, there's also a special case downwind. I don't think any of our boats can sail by the lee, but by the lee means that you've got your mainsail so far out that the boat's coming over, say you have your main so far out that the wind is coming over your starboard side, but your main is still over on your starboard side because it's so far out that it's catching the wind, and your boat's kind of got this V between the hull and the mainsail. Dinghies can do this, sail by the lee, but I don't think any of ours can. But if you're going directly downwind, it's the side which the mainsail lies on. The leeward side is the side where the mainsail lies on. So that provides you with some interesting opportunities downwind. If you're coming up another boat and you're going downwind and you're on port and you suddenly decide you want to be on starboard because you'll have right of way, you can just jibe over, just throw your mainsail over. But notice it's also the mainsail, it's not the boom. So if you crank in your boom, but the bulk of the sail's still out on one side, it's the side that the sail is on. So the other side, obviously, is the windward side, which most people think of as the side the wind's coming over. And then, of course, we'll get into, in a moment, this definition of leeward and windward in terms of rights of way. Keep clear. That's pretty clear, I think. You just keep clear of the right-of-way boat. There's some special cases in the rules for this, just to keep clear, that we'll keep an eye on, keep clear for a little bit. Let me see now. Let me see if I can shift over now. New share. Okay. And just, I'll show you. Let's see if this works. There we go. Go over to my new toy sailboard.
I tried to do so. You did it.
Boat racing education RS course sailboard. So rule 10. So you should be able to see this. So rule 10 is your very typical starboard port. The side you're on is the side opposite your leeward side. So your leeward side is the side that you're away from the wind. So boat B, the red boat here, if everybody can see it, is on starboard, and boat A is on port. So if B comes in like that, A is going to have to yield and dip. And I just thought I'd use an example here that's pretty simple, but it gives you an idea of this tool. This is that tool, I think, Lorena, you may have asked about, that I wrote, because what else have you got to do while while isolated? I was going to give this course anyway, and I was going to use a whiteboard, my regular magnetic whiteboard, and I've got a set of the little boat shapes. And I said, how am I going to do that? That's not going to work well with a camera. And I looked around, and there was just no online like tool to do this. So I put this together, and we'll show you some examples. And oh, Holly Hovis coming in. So that's how that works. And then we go back up here and share back over to the Hello, where'd it go? There we go. So rule 10 is is probably the simplest one that everybody knows. Although I was in a regatta last year and guy called port on me, saying that port had the right of way, and I, of course, assumed he was kidding. He didn't seem to be kidding. He was just not clear on port and starboard. So anyway, it happens. And we do get new racers, and this stuff. One of the reasons to go through this stuff is that some of these rules, when boats meet, they really have to be instinctive. You're seconds away from another boat. You can't go flipping through the rules to look them up. You've really got to know them pretty cold. So on the same tack and overlapped. Now there's two cases when boats are on the same tack. One is clear ahead and clear behind, and that's the next rule that we're coming up on. And overlapped versus non-overlapped. So the rule is really short. When they're overlapped, a windward boat shall keep clear of a leeward boat. So the leeward boat has the right of way if you're overlapped. And you got to go because tack, overlapped, windward, keep clear, leeward, those are all words that are in, let me think. I think I can, where is it? Where's my, those are all italicized words. Where'd my pointer go? There was a pointer here. Just a moment, I'll find it. Can't find my pointer. Well, anyway, those words are in italic, so I brought up a couple of the rules. So overlap says C, clear astern and clear ahead, overlap. So basically it's a 90-degree angle from, you notice the normal position behind the line of beam from the aftermost point of the other boat's hull and equipment in normal position. So for example, on my boat, my boom overhangs the stern of my boat by a few feet. So it's that end of the boom, which a 90-degree angle perpendicular to that determines whether I'm overlapped with another boat. So if you were coming up from behind me, the moment your bow or equipment, if you had a bowsprit, your bowsprit passed perpendicular to my boom, we're now overlapped. Otherwise, you've got a clear ahead and clear astern situation. So that's, and it only applies, you notice these terms always apply to boats on the same tack. They do not apply on the same tack overlapped. So the case there is that, and we go back up to there, and we load.
Did you get the nail?
Rule 11. And so this is the situation. So if you're coming up here, you're clear ahead, A is clear ahead, B is clear astern. Now you're overlapped, and the leeward boat, A here, has rights. Now there's some special cases on these rights, and I'll get to those in a minute. But that boat has rights. If he calls you and tells you, if A calls B and says, I'm tacking now, B's got to give him room. I will also repeat.
No, you can do that.
Yeah, A, there's special cases. A is allowed to sail proper course. There are some special cases on this, so I'll get to those. And share back over here.
That's more, right? The two is
Why does this keep moving around?
You wouldn't tack them, right? If you were there.
Sure.
Yeah.
We tack right in front of them.
Well, yeah, there's not
course.
quite proper course. Yeah. And 12 is pretty simple. Clear ahead, clear astern. That's pretty clear. The boat ahead is free to maneuver. And such is life. Now, while tacking, Now, this is where you got this special case coming up, right? After a boat passes head to wind, she'll keep clear of other boats. So if in that case, and I'll come back to a screenshot of that in a second here, if in that case you tacked in front of that other boat, you have to let that boat, if you just threw it over and tacked in front of the boat, you have to allow that boat room to stay clear. So you can't just do it and have him like almost crash into you. That would be a penalty. So if you're that close, you can't just tack and get away with it. You have to allow enough room for those other boats to stay clear. So they just, this is sort of no crashing. Again, most of these rules are for safety anyway. That's really their point. So that's the point of those. Now going back to there. So the rule 13. Right, so if A is tacked here and B is just coming up fast, and it's going to be close, you can't just throw it over and say, oh, well, I had rights of way because, I was the leeward boat and I could tack. Yeah, but with restrictions. You couldn't, if B hit you, technically what would happen is B would be guilty of breaking rule 14, which is no crashing, but A would be guilty with not allowing room while tacking, breaking rule 13. Technically what would happen is boat B here would be exonerated as long as there wasn't any died or something, but B would be exonerated because A initiated it by breaking the rule. Okay, now there are a bunch of limitations. So those first rules, which are port and starboard, windward, leeward, clear ahead, clear behind, and while tacking. The next set of rules have general limitations on things, and this is where it starts to get a little tricky. So there we go. So avoiding contact, my favorite. You can kind of read it. Don't need to read all these. Room, by the way, that's a definition. Space a boat it needs in existing conditions to comply with their obligations. So you have to allow, a boat may have a right of way or over another boat, but you have to allow the other boat room to get out of your way. That's all part of Rule 14. Mark room, for example, we'll get into that in Rule 18. Room to sail to the mark when her proper course is to sail close to it. That's mark room. Room to round the mark is necessary to sail the course. Does not include room to tack. So if you're coming in on port and you're going to have to tack, it does not guarantee you have room to tack. Tacking is a special case around a mark, so we'll get into that. Rule 31 that's referenced over there under room on the left, Rule 31 is touching a mark. That's the touching the mark rule. Basically what they're saying is you can't force a boat. If that boat is entitled to room, you can't force that boat to touch a mark by crowding them out. Okay, some definitions. Proper course. Now, proper course is important in a couple of these places, so I just wanted to review these again.
Coming up like this.
Yeah. So a proper course
coming up like this.
Is not necessarily directly towards the mark.
Give this boat room to go around.
Right. So proper course is the course a boat would sail to the finish. Note you have no proper course before your starting signal. So before the starting gun, horn, flag, division flag comes down, you have no proper course. This is important later when reading the rules because some of the rules talk about proper course, but therefore don't apply before a starting signal because you have no proper course. So that is probably the single most tricky part, especially around the starting line of proper course. So proper course could be almost anything if it would be reasonable for a boat to do that maneuver, to tack, jibe, turn, adjust sails, whatever it is, to get around as best it could. The proper course might not be the same for all boats because of their boat handling, different spinnaker configurations. But if it's reasonably argued that that boat was on its proper course, it applies. If you suddenly decide to throw in another tack to force another boat in that you would never do to sail your course, that's not allowed. So if you take advantage of a right-of-way and do something to throw another boat off, and what you did wouldn't have been anything you would do to get to the next mark in a reasonable time, you might be guilty of breaking a rule if it references proper course. I want to just make a note on a mark here, and I'll get into this again, but I want to repeat it a few times. An object, the sailing instructions require a boat to leave on a specified side, so your race committee boat at the start is a mark, you know, a race committee vessel. Notice an anchor line or an object attached accidentally to a mark is not part of it. So if you sail by the front of your race committee boat and your keel trips the anchor line of the race committee boat, you have not hit the mark. You have not hit the race committee boat. Same is true with a regular racing mark. If your keel just nicks that, you have not touched it. If, I don't know, the race committee has forgotten a line and the line is accidentally floating behind it, not a standoff buoy, that's purposely, not accidentally put there, that's purposely put there. But if it was accidentally dragging behind and you hit that, you have not touched the mark. Also, fetching is important in a few of these rules. Fetching is when basically you're making your final run to a mark. So you're not going to tack, you're not going to jibe, you're going for the mark and you're planning on rounding it. The other thing I want to note is that the race rules are pretty clear that we do port roundings, but they don't have to. The sailing instructions can say, or the race committee can set a course and specify that a particular mark is going to be a starboard rounding. They can do that. The reason we do port roundings as the default is actually a side effect of all the other rules, that the starboard boat has rights over a port boat and windward leeward at a windward mark. It's actually just safer from a right-of-way perspective to have a port rounding than a starboard rounding, and that's why we have mostly port roundings. The other thing I want to talk about just briefly, because there's some, and I'll mention it again later, that there's some confusion a little bit about rounding. Here is the Port Jefferson Yacht Club marks. On a weekend for a distance race, we might go out to middle ground up in the top. Is my... I really thought I had a... Let's try this. Oh, yeah, there we go. I think you can see that. Yeah, you can see that little circle there. So out here by middle ground, when a course is laid, the terminology is in the sailing instructions is not rounding a mark, it's leaving a mark to port. You leave it to port. It doesn't matter how close you are. you just leave it by your port side, and it's generally accepted that that means that at some point your boat has passed a beam of it, and your stern has passed a beam of it. You've now passed that mark. You've left it behind you on your port side. So I have a friend who races over in Europe, in England and the Med, and over there they actually separate. They differentiate their marks. They have rounding marks and they have restricted marks. And the restricted mark is one that you might pass and you have to leave on your port side or your starboard side. And a rounding mark is one where you'd actually have to turn. And they do that to clarify. But when we say, and for example, I think one of the races last year, we started SF, we go out to J and then come back, and we included that H was one of the marks. So you'd go from SF around J and back. Or you'd go from SF out to middle ground and back. So if you were going from SF out to middle ground and back, they might say that A is the next mark. So the course would be from start finish to A to K and back. But because of the wind, if the wind was coming from the north, you might actually sail out at an angle way the heck out here into the anchorage ground area and then tack and go up to K. You've still left A to port. No problem. In fact, if you wanted to and you had time, you could leave at SF. You could go out Long Island Sound, up the coast of New England, around over the top of Canada, down to around, come back up after going around South America, come back up, come back through the East River and finished, and you've still left A to port. So you've...
You wouldn't be back by 9:30.
No, probably not. No, you'd have to have a really good wind. But yeah, so I just wanted to point that out, that if for example, SF, H, J, if you decided to go up here in the middle by A, as long as you've left H to port, there's no rule that you have to round it. You just have to leave it to port. So just wanted to clarify that really, because I've had that question actually a number of times. So
You think you have to have really go
as long as you've left it.
Went around.
Yeah. So let's see. Acquiring the right of way. So say you do tack. Here's another one back to your question, Ed. When a boat acquires the right of way, she'll initially give the other boat room to keep clear. That's just another way of saying that if you're on port, the two of you, and one turns over and is now on starboard, you have to give that other boat room to stay clear. So let's see, rule 15. So if B starts out here, A starts out here, and then at their next position, you've got B1, and A has now tacked over, see now right here at B and A, B's on starboard, A's on port. B has the right of way. They come in to each other. A now tacks over onto starboard, but is clear ahead. A is now the clear ahead boat, so under Rule 12, A has the right of way, but has to give B room to stay clear. If B comes up and it's just too close and bumps A is going to be guilty. So you have to give the other boat room to stay clear. Now, if you give B enough room that B can do this and just dodge around you, that's okay. You now have the right of way, and B has to stay clear, but you have to give them enough room to stay clear. Another case where that can occur is back here, and we'll get to this rule in just, actually we'll get to this rule in just a moment. So there's all these weird special cases which can be annoying, and why they're not clear, I don't know. Changing course. When a right-of-way boat changes course, she'll give the other boat room to keep clear. And when after a starting signal, Note after a starting signal, not before you start the starting signal, but afterwards, a port tack boat is keeping clear by sailing to pass astern of a starboard tack boat. The starboard tack boat shall not change course if as a result the port tack boat would immediately need to change course to continue to keep clear. So this is where this gets really fun. So here, 16.1. When a right-of-way boat changes course, we kind of just went through this. The right-of-way boat was A because it's overlapped and it's the leeward boat. And if it changes course, it has to give B room to stay clear. Okay, 16.2, after the starting signal, these boats, A is on port, and because B is on starboard, B has the right of way. So A is going to dip behind and assume position A1. A is going to dip behind B. B has to allow them to do that. B can't hit the brakes, can't suddenly decide to luff up and get in their way. B has the right of way, but they have to stand on. They have to let A dip. Now this is before this is after the start. Before the start, weird things can happen, but B doesn't have to do that. Before the start, B is free to mess with A and change course in a way that would force A to change. So before the start, and we'll get into the start in a little bit, but before the start, it gets a little dicey before the start. But once you're racing, that's that rule. And then the other one that is again, we're in section B, general limitations. So these are limitations that have to do with all these other rules. So same tack, proper course. Now this is the one that affects people at the start, because at the start, before your starting signal, you do not have a proper course. So if a boat clear astern comes up within 2 hull lengths, so this is like windward, leeward, this is overlapped, but not just overlapped, within 2 hull lengths. And it's recognized that that's really close, and it's recognized that our boats don't turn like a car. They pivot on their keel, which means their stern swings and can swing out one way and swing in another way, and you can, if you're within 2 boat lengths, you've got to watch how you maneuver, because if you turn away, your stern can pivot into another boat, right? So, so there's a special case if you're within 2 boat lengths and on a proper course. Again, this does not apply at the start, before the start, so it gets a little dicey. She shall not sail above her proper course while they remain on the same tack and overlapped. So what that means, Ed, back to your comment before, is that, yes, it is true that, go back here, Rule 17. If you come up within 2 boat lengths, there is that special case. Within 2 boat lengths, this A1 now has the right of way. He can come up and ask B to give him room, but he can't sail above his proper course. So he can ask for room to come up a little higher because he can sail higher, and that would be his proper course. But if he's within 2 boat lengths, he can't force B off, except before the start. Then he can force, and this is the starting rule. If these boats were down here before the start, say, let me move my starting line up.
The way B
out of the
would
way.
give him room is he would just head up.
Before
as
the
he
starting
goes,
signal,
right?
that doesn't apply. So if they're really close together, A here is allowed to go
Push him
above do that and force B to have to turn off, or force B over the line even. And this is why you have that whole starting thing at the line. If they were really close to the line, A could do this, could come up like that, and force B to sail over the line. That's why that starting rule. So rule 17, same tack, proper course, you have no proper course before your starting signal. So that's that case. So within 2 boat lengths, what you were saying earlier, Ed, would matter. You can't just tack in front of another boat within 2 boat lengths
Ed?
if you've come up.
Yeah.
I didn't say that.
Oh, I think that was one of your earlier questions about when boats were overlapped. If the overlap boat wanted to tack in front of the other boat, they can, unless they're within 2 boat lengths out on the course.
But you would only do that if you wanted him to go
Push
over
him
the
up,
store.
push him
Right.
up.
Push them up, right?
Over
Because
the
you have
line.
no. So rule 17 just doesn't apply at the start. You can do, if you got the right of way because you're the leeward boat at the start, you can push people over. You couldn't do that out on the course after you've started. And you couldn't do it at the starting line. Once the gun goes off, if these 2 boats were close together and the starting gun goes off like now they both have a proper course. So now rule 17 applies, and you can't, the proper course for A is probably, out like this someplace, and that's his proper course. He can't now mess with B, because he's within 2 tall lengths and rule 17 applies. So this is why these rules get a little complicated, because they jump around and one has an exception to this. Like rule 17 here has says this rule does not apply if the overlap begins while the windward boat is required by rule 13 to keep clear, meaning they tack. Rule 13 is tacking, so it doesn't apply if the overlap occurs because the windward boat is tacking and their angle spun and they're required to keep clear. So they might be overlapped because the angle between the boats changed, but rule 13 says they've got to keep clear anyway, so rule 13 takes precedent. So it's just so it's good. We're running a little late because we started a little bit late, but if anybody wanted, that's the pennant for 5 if anybody needed a 5-minute intermission. Okay, so that was your basic port, starboard, windward, leeward set of rules. The next section, C, part 2, section C. Part 2 is when boats meet. Section C is marks and obstructions. Now, we don't really have a case for an obstruction in a strict sense, although a boat that has the right of way is an obstruction to you. So there is a couple of examples of that, but we don't generally use something like, I don't know, one of the day marks at the Port Jefferson Harbor entrance. We don't use that as a mark because the jetty would be a continuing obstruction. And it just gets hazardous, but there are cases where boats race near obstructions. So there are rules for that, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, except where it applies to a boat. Mark again, we went through that. Fetching is when you're going right at the mark and you're going to round it or pass it. I'll leave it on the required side. Again, no, leave it on the required side. Doesn't say round it, just leave it. An obstruction can be a boat. It can be a mark. So if, for example, a boat is in front of you, they're clear ahead. If they go into irons and they're in front of you and they're still clear ahead and they're dead in the water, they're an obstruction and you have to follow the obstruction rules. So you have to keep clear. And clear ahead, clear astern, overlap. All those are going to come into play here. So the preamble is important. Again, for this whole section C, which is mark room, room to pass an obstruction, and room to tack in an obstruction. Those are the 3 rules in this section C, marks and obstructions. all of them are under the preamble here. So note, Section C rules do not apply at a starting mark from the time boats are approaching them to start until they have passed them. So your pin end and your race committee boat are your marks at your starting line, and they do not apply. These rules, 18, like zones around them and things like that, don't apply at those marks from the time the boats are approaching them to start. And that there isn't a definition for approaching them to start, but it is generally agreed in the case book that that means you're on your final approach. So you're not sailing out beyond the committee boat and getting ready to turn. You've turned and you're now coming in towards the line to start. That's generally agreed upon to be what approaching them to start. You don't have to be headed straight towards the line, but you're not going to tack, you're not going to jibe, you're going to go, you're going to maybe turn up, that's fine, but you're on your final approach to the line. So that's generally agreed upon what that means. So if you are on your final approach, none of these rules apply. So if you're coming in real close to another boat, and normally you'd if it was at a mark, you'd have to give them room to get by the committee boat. If you're on your final approach, you do not have to give them room. You can't force them to crash. That breaks all kinds of rules. But you can force them up, and they would have to turn off and go around or figure out some other way. So these don't apply on that final approach. Okay, the zone. The zone. 3 boat lengths from the mark, and the closest boat to the mark is the measurement. So if my boat, which is smaller than most of the boats we race against, Gene's boat may be smaller, but my boat, if I was the closest, that would be the zone. If Chuck's boat, you know, a 40-plus footer, that's the thing. Also, it's generally assumed that if there's any question about the zone, you err on the side of it being the zone, not because we're not going to bring out tape measures out there. So, you know, so if it looks like about 3 boats, assume it's 3 boats. That's the general guideline. Or look for the dotted lines in the water. You know, either way. Now, notice when it applies and doesn't apply. Doesn't apply outside the zone. Forget it. In the zone, on the final run towards the starting, on final runs towards the starting line to start, we just went through that. It does not apply. Opposite tacks on a windward mark. Notice windward mark, a downwind mark. Opposite tacks, it still applies. But opposite tacks at a windward mark, you're back to Rule 10, port starboard. Starboard boat has rights. And after you have room to round, or after you have rounded. So if you've been given room to round that mark, this rule no longer applies, and you're back to port starboard, windward leeward. You're back to the regular rules. And if you've rounded the mark, you're back to the regular rules. The regular rules apply to you. Port starboard, Rule 18 no longer applies to you. So if you've been given room and you're going around it, you're going by it, or you've rounded it after you've rounded it, the regular rules now apply. So when does it apply? When any of the boats are within the zone and any part of the boat, which, by the way, that means a bowsprit on a spin boat, for example, you know, anything like that. Before a boat is on the final run towards the starting line, we talked about the starting line, applies only when boats are on the same tack. So port and starboard, your regular port and starboard rules, but if you're on the same tack. And it's based on the overlap situation when the first boat enters the zone. Now here's the reason. Boats are going to be close together. They're moving fast. They're going to be looking to do something around that mark within seconds, probably, not minutes. Hopefully we have enough wind for that to be the case. But you've got a lot of boats in a close area moving fast. So that's why we have Rule 18, and that's why it's based on the overlap situation when the first boat enters the zone. Are they overlapped or are they not overlapped? That is when the decision is made, and it applies for the rest of the time that the boats are in the zone until they round.
Dave?
Yeah.
Does the spinnaker count then as part of the boat? You said bowsprit, but I'm assuming on a downwind
It
run,
does.
whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll bring up the actual rule in a moment. And this is where I think they could do better when they describe boats. But boat is generally, unless it says the hull of the boat, you'll see rules that say the hull of the boat. It generally means the boat and any of its equipment or crew in normal operating position. So a crew member pretending to be a figurehead and hanging out over the bow, sticking his hand out, doesn't count because that's not normal operating procedure position. But I wanted to start with the general guide first before I hit the rules, because it may give you some idea. So you're in the zone. You want to avoid tacking in the zone if you're near other boats, and there's all kinds of reasons for this. This is one of Chuck's favorites. You lose all rights to room if you tack. So if you tack in the zone, you're coming in on port, and you tack, you lose all rights. You're back to regular rights of way. And so you have to follow Rule 13, tacking, meaning giving other people room to maneuver. 16, changing course. You're probably going to be in Rule 17 because you're going to be close to other boats with an overlap. It's just a bad idea, and I'll get into that a little bit. You can do it. There's no rule that you can't tack in the zone. It's just be careful if you're near other boats, because the rules change after you tack. I often, because of the currents and thing, like to come in on port, but I gonna keep an eye. I know, and I've done this. I've come in on port because I like the current on that side of the course, and it's bringing me down to the mark. And I see another boat in there, and I will swing. I know I'm going to lose rights if I tack, and they're going to come up behind me, and I'm going to have hell to pay. So I will, swing onto their stern and just take that little extra time to do my tack, clear that other boat, and then go around the mark. So I'm very aware of the tacking situation. Again, the boat positions when the first boat enters the zone, and the inside overlapped boat, which on an upwind mark is your leeward boat, or the boat closest to the boat closest to the mark, or clear ahead, on the time they enter the zone, has rights, even if an overlap occurs after that, or an overlap is broken. They were clear ahead, but now another boat comes up on them. You have to look at the position when the first boat enters the zone. Are you overlapped or are you not overlapped? If you're overlapped on the inside, whoever the inside boat is has rights. You got to give them room. If you're on the same tack, you've got to give them room to round that mark. So it's pretty simple if you just think about, okay, we're coming up on the mark. Where's about 3 boat lengths? It's about there. And the boat in front of me is clear ahead and they normally have rights because of Rule 12. Doesn't matter if you come up on their inside, they have rights. You got to give them rights because there's so many boats, so much is happening real close together. If you manage to sneak up on them and you have an inside overlap, you're on the same, and I'll get into a couple of pictures of this. You will now have rights even if they pull ahead of you, break the overlap, doesn't matter. You've got rights, you can go. A note on the downwind mark. If you are headed to a downwind mark and the boat entitled to room must jibe, if they must jibe, only if they must jibe, they can't just keep sailing. They can't hold another boat off to the side if they must jibe. If they don't have to jibe, then they can keep sailing as much as they want. So it's a small detail, but if you're at a downwind mark, it matters a little bit. You can't just keep pushing a boat off if you must jibe. If you don't have to jibe, if you've lined yourself up so you're just going to come up at the mark, then this rule, then that part of the rule doesn't apply. So here's the actual text. Basically what I just talked about. However, it does not apply between a boat approaching a mark and one leaving it. Remember, once you've rounded that mark and you're leaving it, you're back to regular port, starboard, windward, leeward rules between the boats. So 18.1. So here, 18.1, A, between boats on opposite tacks. So we've got an opposite tack situation. B is on starboard. B has rights. Rule 18 is not applying here because A and B are on opposite tacks. Even if they're both in the zone, doesn't matter who hit the zone first, they're on opposite tacks, doesn't apply. Now here between B is actually looks exactly the same as A between boats on opposite tacks when the proper course at the mark for one but not both of them is to tack. Well, A obviously is going to have to tack around to do that. There is a small window of a gray area that they added this B. There's a small gray area apparently between the two boats, so I'm not even going to try and get into that. Somebody complained and such was life. C, between a boat approaching it and one leaving it. So if B is leaving the mark, they've rounded, and A is approaching the mark, A is on starboard. Doesn't matter what happened with B, whether they entered the zone first, it doesn't matter. They're leaving the mark, they've rounded the mark, they've been given room for it. You're back to regular rules, and B has to follow just normal,
He just has
regular
to
right-of-way.
head up a little bit, right?
Yeah. They just have to follow regular right-of-way rules. A has the right-of-way, so he's going to have to, go around A. Yeah, and I think that was C. Yeah, that was C. We don't have a continuing obstruction case, but if there was a continuing obstruction, there was a wall here or something, jetty, something like that, you'd switch over to Rule 19 rules, which is obstructions, but that's all that's saying. By the way, a little advertising for my tool here. It's free to anybody that wants to use it for any reason. Race committees, to review protests remotely. You can set up your boats any way you want. You can spin them with the controls, switch their sides. You can add a mark. You can turn on its zone ring if you want. You can turn it into a line or a gate. You can drag these around, and then you can save it. You can enter a file name in here and click save, and it'll save the image as it is for later use. And that's how I'm reloading it. You can add wind, you can add current if you want, and stuff. So that's the end of that ad. So but it's free to use. Share. So that's when Rule 18 applies. And again, Rule 18 has a lot of words, but that's why I summarized it earlier. When boats are overlapped, again, the outside boat will give the inside boat mark room to go around the mark without touching it. if they're, again, like I said, the position of the boats when the first one hits it determines it. So if the boats are overlapped, when that first boat reaches the zone, after that, that outside boat has to give them room, even if the overlap is broken. In you'll see that in C. Same is true if the first boat is clear ahead. They have right of way under the rule 12, clear ahead, clear astern. They've got right of way. So when they hit that zone, that's it. If the rear boat catches up with them and comes zooming in, too bad, that lead boat has the right of way. So when a boat is required to give mark room by 18.2b, that B, she'll continue to do so even if an overlap is broken or a new one begins. Also proper course. You also have to give that boat room, not just to round it, but to sail a proper course, which, you know, could be whatever it is. And they cease to apply after that boat has mark room. So if that boat has been given mark room and then they decide to just keep going for some reason, you're back to regular right-of-way rules. And if there's reasonable doubt about the overlap, if it's really clear, if it's not so clear when you enter the zone, obtained, it's assumed that they did not. So just, I think most people, at least at our level of racing, in the Olympics, they might not be, the America's Cup, they might not be, so they may be a little pickier, but we'll generally give people the benefit of the doubt. So that's, let's see, 18.2, no, we did that. So, tacking. Remember, I mentioned that tacking in the zone is generally a bad idea. If a boat in the zone that's to be left to port, again, this would not apply on a starboard one, and it has to do with whether you're on starboard tack or port tack. But our normal racing, we leave our marks to port. If you pass head to wind from port to starboard, not from starboard to port, but from port to starboard, so you're coming in on port tack, like I said, this is where I mentioned that, and I'm just repeating it now to kind of, you got to sink these in so that it's instinctive. Tacking in the zone is bad. This is why 18.3. So if you come in on port, you throw over to starboard tack to fetch the mark, you'll not cause a boat on that starboard tack to sail above close hauled, meaning, you know, basically flap their sails. In order to avoid contact. So you tack over, you're going slow, there's some guy coming, zooming in on starboard, right for the mark, and you force them to turn up into the wind to avoid you, you've broken that rule. If, because you now lost your rights, because you tacked, they have to now dip below you and they overlap you on the leeward side, they have normal leeward boat rights to sail their proper course, which is, of course, to go around the mark. So if you force them off that mark and they miss the mark or they touch it, you are guilty. So that's the rule there. And I went through the kind of the jibing case. But that's why tacking in the zone, all kinds of rules start to come into play. 13, 11, 14, don't crash. 16, maybe changing course. All kinds of things come in against you if you tack in the zone. Okay, so we got some, do I have a, I just want to check something here.
The zone is anywhere around any mark.
Rebuild.
3 boat lengths around any mark.
Any mark.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's, why am I not seeing this? I gotta go over here. Yeah, so 18.2A, that's your overlap situation. 18.2B, first one entered the mark, there is an overlap, so after that, B has rights because they're the inside overlapped boat, so B has rights from then on because the first boat just entered the zone. B was overlapped to the inside. B has rights from then on in. And again, it's because you're like seconds away from that mark probably, or less than a minute, and there's usually a lot of boats. B is leaving the mark, so regular rules apply. So that's, and I think I had one for F, 18.2F. Yeah, so 18.2F, once you have that overlap, it doesn't matter if it's been broken. The inside boat has rights. Okay, let me go back over to my screen. Other rules.
So A has rights over C and B
Yep.
has B, right?
Oh, there is one point that I didn't mention earlier. I forgot to mention, and Lorena just reminded me of it. In the case where there's in the definition of overlap, the rule says, the overlap rule says that if you've got a middle boat, now B is not overlapped with C. It just doesn't, so B is not overlapped with C physically, but because it's overlapped with a middle boat, which is also overlapped with C, the rule is that B is overlapped with C. So in this case, B, even though the hull doesn't overlap the bow of C or anything on C, because there's an intermediate boat which is also overlapped with both boats, the rule said, the definition of overlap says that B is overlapped with C. So now from this point on, B has inside rights over A and also over C, even though physically there doesn't look like there's an overlap, but the rule for overlap says that middle boat, overlap to there, they're all overlapped. B is overlapped with C in that case. That's how the rule for overlap works. So if you had a whole bunch of boats, you know, if we add another boat here, the B is overlapped with D by the overlap rule. So B wins here because they got there first. So generally the first boat that gets there sets what the rules are.
You have good hearing, Dave. Even when I whisper questions, I can hear them.
I was just using Zoom's read the mind of the participants mode.
Hey, Dave, I've got a
Yeah.
question about that overlap rule and the zone.
Yeah.
If you go back, can you go back to that?
That or the rule itself?
Yeah, no, that
Yeah.
one. So,
Yep.
so if D, which is the windward boat,
Yep.
okay, if that one crossed the line first and they were all overlapped the other way, do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I got you. Yeah, yeah. So let's think that one through. So if you had, well, B is overlapped with D, but is the inside boat, so B still wins.
Yeah, so B still wins. It's not the who gets to the line first. It's who's the downwind boat, who's the inside boat. Correct.
Yeah, exactly. It's the orientation of the boats when the first boat gets to the line. So
Yeah.
so when the first boat gets to the line, however they're oriented, that determines the rights thereafter. So if that was the position there, but B, I don't know, it was a slower boat, and B dropped back like this, these guys moved forward like that, and B dropped back, there's no overlap, but B still has rights because they were lined up. So these guys just have to keep sailing out here, waiting for B to, you know, drag their tail around the mark. So,
Dave?
yeah.
There's a boat coming in on a reach that overlaps those boats, say almost a beam on to one of those.
Right.
That's an overlap also, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, as long as, and you know, the definition is the stern, a line astern of one of the boats. C's stern doesn't overlap, but D's here probably does overlap. But C is the inside, you know. So if you had him coming in on a reach like this, he's still with that transom, the sternmost point. He's overlapped with C, who's overlapped with A, who's overlapped with B, but B has the inside overlap in that case.
Right, right.
Yeah, so B is the inside overlap boat and has the right of way at that point. Yep. Now, D very likely has to give B room, but doesn't have to let them round first, just has to give them room. So D most likely is coming in fast and hot, and D just has to watch out to make sure B doesn't do this. But yeah, if he's coming in hot on a reach, he's probably going to get there first, and he can round first. It doesn't say you have to round in that order. It just says if B came up here, D would have to veer off and give B room. You just have to give him room. You don't have to let him round first. You just have to give him room. That's all it says. So that's an important point. So, whoops, that was not supposed to go back. So there is this thing called exoneration. If you break a rule, you broke a rule. That's it. You broke a rule. However, there are cases where you were forced into breaking that rule, and therefore you're exonerated. You're given credit. So, for example, if another boat broke a rule and it forced you to have to break Rule 31, which is touching the mark, you had to touch the mark because it was just too close. Well, you're exonerated from Rule 31. If you really feel that that boat broke a rule and forced you close, you had rights around that mark, and they forced you close to it and you bumped into it, you don't have to take your turn penalty. You're exonerated. But you better be clear that that's what happened. But yeah, so when a boat's sailing within the room or mark room to which he is entitled, if you break some of those other rules, you're going to be exonerated. And since we're in the other rules section, I'll also talk about starting rules a little bit. A boat sailing towards the pre-start side of the line. That means maybe you're actually over the line before your start and you're coming back towards the pre-start side, or you've been over early and you're coming back to the pre-start side of the line to restart, because that's the rule. If you're, and I'll get into those in a second, but that's a penalty. If you're basically taking a penalty, you have to keep clear of other boats. So you have to take the penalty as soon as possible, but not so that you're going to be in the way of other boats. So you have to get clear. So if you're taking a penalty turn or you're going off to come back and restart after being over early, you've got to stay clear of other boats. That can make it a little dicey and really annoying. I had to do that once, and we had to just dump all the sails and slow down because there was no way I could tack or jibe, and I just had to wait for the other boats to get clear of me before I could turn back to the line. Truly annoying. So, and a boat moving astern, that never happens to anybody, well, except me in one race, as you recall, Charlie, last year. Just a a note. If you, boats that are in trouble are obstructions. There's a definition of capsized here, but if you go to help another boat and you're required to, if another boat's in trouble and they need help and you go to help them, do yourself a favor and take a quick glance at your watch, because if you help another boat, the general guidelines are you should not be penalized for doing that. So if you took 5 minutes to help pull somebody out of the water and get them on board that boat, and then you resumed sailing, you can ask the race committee for redress because you did that, and the race committee can meet and say, okay, we could give you that 5 minutes back. And if you had people that saw it or stuff. So if you do help another boat, it's just a note there. Go help them. They threw their skipper overboard, and you liked the guy, he bought you a beer, and so. And again, 24.1, I've seen this happen at regattas. I definitely have seen this happen at regattas multiple times. A boat not racing, get out of the way of a boat that's racing. And you should not purposely try, if somebody's taking a penalty, you shouldn't purposely try and mess with them. If they're taking a penalty, let them take the penalty, unless they're breaking the rule and not being clear, but don't go out and mess with them.
I have a question. Quick question. It might not be relevant, but what if there is a boat that's not even part of the race at all, just like a random person is on the course?
They're an
Does
obstruction.
somebody tell them to leave, or?
Oh, you can. Yeah, certainly can say, hey, we're racing. Absolutely. But they would technically be an obstruction. So, and I had that once. Luckily, my proper course was going to take me real close to them, and I did that, and I snuck up behind them. They didn't see me or hear me coming. It was a power boat sitting in the middle of the course, and all of a sudden I was 3 feet from their side and went like, whoa. It was fun. Okay, conduct of a race. These rules apply to the race committee as well as the rest of us. So just a quick note, and I'll mention it again. Approaching them to start is that final approach towards the starting line, not when you're wandering around trying to figure out whether you're going to start on port or starboard. Not then, but when you're committed to that starting line, that's approaching them to start. Racing, and we'll get into this a little bit later. You are racing from your preparatory signal, which, turn on my spotlight, which is the 4-minute point. When the preparatory flag goes up, you are racing from then until you either abandon the race or you not just get across the finish line, but you clear the finish line. So while you were on the finish line, you may have finished, and I'll get to this again, you may have finished the race when the first part of your boat or sails in normal operating position crossed the line, but you are still technically racing and all the rules apply to you until you clear the line. I'll repeat it again later. You don't have to clear the line going forward. If the current's against you and you just make it, your bow just crosses and you get the horn, you can drop back, clear the line, and go back, break open the beers. And then you have stopped finishing. But you are racing until you have cleared the finish line. And you are racing from your prep. Whoops, I wasn't supposed to do that. From your prep flag. Now these other flags that I have here, our prep flag is the Papa flag, flag letter P, the blue with the white center. Race committees can use these other rules. I'm not going to go into them here. India, Zulu, uniform, India with Zulu, or black flag. They're used for when boats are getting a little too aggressive at the start and you've just had too many general recalls, too many boats over early too often. The race committee is free to do these, and they basically have increasingly severe penalties if you're over early or in certain positions around the race. I'm not going to go into all the details of those because we've never used them in Port Jeff. I don't know whether MISA has ever used them. Generally, in our kind of racing, you don't need to use them.
Dave?
Yeah.
So since we have frequently more than one class flag.
Right.
So is this like, for instance, we usually start with the spin class, and then
Right.
so non-spin isn't starting until their flag goes up, right?
Correct.
And,
Correct.
and so they're not there. They don't have to.
Yeah.
By,
Right. So the say the Spinnaker class is in sequence. You know, they're
Right.
in their starting sequence. At 5 minutes before, nobody's racing yet. They're just sailing and monitored about. So the warning signal at 5 minutes before, which by the way can be changed if the sailing instructions want to make that 6 or 10, they can do anything they want. But we use 5 minutes. Well, that's just a warning signal that the prep is coming up. And from that prep, that division is racing. No other divisions are racing yet. So all the other divisions have to stay clear. So yeah.
okay.
From the prep. So you have to get out of the way from the divisions before you once they have their prep flag up. Another important thing to mention here is that the flags set the timing, not the horns or guns. The flags set the timings. And that's important for the race committee to understand, that the flag is the most important thing, not the horn. If the horn is wrong, race committee can just continue on if that flag went up on time. They probably will do something different, and I'll get to that in a minute, but it is the flag that actually sets the time. And then the reason for that is partly because on a really long line, the people at the far end of the line may not hear a sound, or it takes, the sound some, quarter of a second to get down there. Not that most people care about the quarter of a second, but it can take some time. Okay. The infamous AP flag, usually the no wind flag, also nicknamed by some the cat in the hat flag, the red and white stripes. The race committee can postpone a race for any reason before they start a division, or any reason at all. They have misplaced the bottle opener for their beers. Not a good reason, but it's a reason. They could be searching around for their bottle opener and decide to postpone the start of the race. They can do that. Now, the most common reason, of course, is no wind. But a less common reason, for example, might be, say you're in the start sequence and the flag halyard jams. Remember, the flags set the timing. So you go to drop the P flag, the prep flag, at a minute to go before the start. You go to do that, and it hangs up, and you can't get the flag down. And now the timing is off, and everybody's looking at their timers on their boats and saying, why aren't we at Papa down right now? The race committee can say, okay, we got to sort this out because it's not going to be fair. Something screwed up. You can just flip up that AP flag, keep it handy on a pole, and just flip it up and say, hey, we're going into a postponement while we sort this out, and you can restart the whole thing. So anytime up until the starting signal for a division, the race committee is free to postpone the race for any reason that they feel is necessary. The November flag starts with NO, as in no, and that's an abandonment. So that's the two flags. Don't usually use that, but you can if time expires or whatever. So we don't usually fly the November flag because people are so far out. We just call them on the radio and say this race ain't happening. And but technically, you should fly the November flag, because if somebody's radio isn't on, they've turned it off, they can't hear it, you'll sound a horn. People look at the committee boat, and if November's up, it means we're done. Recalls. These are the recall flags. Again, we often don't do an individual recall flag. You really should, because it's the flag that actually, with a horn, a flag with a horn is popped up for a recall. There is no requirement, none, there's no requirement that the race committee has to identify the boat and tell them that they were over. They are expected to know that they were over the line early. So now, our race committee, we're club racing, we're beer can racing. They'll call on the radio and say, hey, Clara J, my boat, you are over early. Okay, fine. So we're a little lax on that, but that's technically what they should do. They should, if they were running a serious race, and I've seen some serious races. I saw a New York Yacht Club Invitational up in Newport in Rhode Island, and they just raised the individual recall flag. Nothing on the radio. The boat was, if that boat continued sailing the race and didn't restart properly, disqualified. That's tough. So it's hard. General recall, the race committee would call a general recall, and that's the first substitute flag. They would call a general recall if there were so many boats over or on the line, they couldn't tell which boats were over early. Because they do have to know which boat is over early so that they can penalize them if they don't restart. They have to know, the race committee has to know. But say there's so many boats on the line, you can't see their bows, and you can't tell if more than one boat was over early. You can do a general recall, call everybody back, and just reset the sequence. The rule for the committee, just so everybody knows, if you have AP up or a general recall up, the rule is when you drop that, which can be whenever you want, when you drop that flag, that starts the clock, and you have 1 minute until the warning. So if you're restarting a division, you say, okay, I'm going to restart it at 15 after the hour. You'd keep AP up or general recall up until 14 after the hour, drop it, and then the warning will go at 15 after the hour, and you'll go right back into your sequence. So 1 minute between dropping the flag and the warning for the division, and you get things going again. So that's the guideline for, that's the rule actually.
That's the recall flag. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, recall, any part of the hull, crew, equipment on the course side of the starting line, and that's means in normal operating position. If there's a so that's your individual recall. And do I have? I think I do. I mentioned we don't use Rule 30, which is all the funky start. So there's your over early situation. 31, 40, okay, just so I knew. Almost there. Sailing the course. So you'll start, go sailing, leave, not round, leave every mark on the side that it's specified, which is port for is the default for most of us. And the string theory. The string theory is that if you had a string starting from the start, it would round each one on the right side, and if you drew it tight, that's your course. Somebody had some fun with that. You may correct any errors. So if you rounded the wrong mark, you just thought that was B and it was C. Well, you want to think about that, because remember, if there's 7 boats racing and you come in 7th, your point is 7. If there's 7 boats racing and you abandon the race, if you drop out, your score is 8. So if you did that and went out towards C and didn't pass B that you were supposed to, and you suddenly pass C and you go, oh, it says C on it, you might want to actually go back to B and round it and continue the race. Even though you're probably at that point going to come in last, you might want to, because it makes a difference of 1 point in the series scoring. So you might, want to not just say, oh, hell with this and open the beers. You might want to actually think about finishing. So anyway, that's just a little point on that. And again, you just have to leave it on the side. You don't have to necessarily physically go turn around there. Now, a note on finishing. Again, a boat finishes when any part of her hull, crew, or equipment in normal position, I think this goes back to one of the questions earlier, crosses the finish line from the course side, meaning the side from the last mark. And she has not finished if she needs to take a penalty. Rule 44 is penalties. Correct an error that you didn't sail the course properly, or goes off in some weird direction. But again, the definition of racing and finishing mean you're racing until you clear the finish line. That's down at the bottom. So if you're in, say, light wind and there's a current and you come up and your bow crosses and you finish, you get the horn, that is your finishing time. But if that current now drags you down and you touch the mark that defines the line, you have to go back onto the course side and take your turn for hitting a mark, because you had not finished racing until you had cleared the line. So all the rules still apply to you, even though you have finished. Until you've cleared the line on either side, you don't have to continue to cross it. You just have to clear the line. You're still racing. And so if you touch that mark or another boat comes in, all the racing rules, you're still within the zone of a mark. The 2 ends of that line are marks. So rule 18 applies because you're in the zone. Now you're not going to round that mark, but there's rights of way and things. Everything applies until you've cleared the line. So if you do have a penalty, you've got to go take it on the course side and refinish. It's just life. Touching a mark. Oh, and another point on finishing, this goes back to the earlier question. That's all the equipment in normal position. So say it's a downwind finish. No, a spinnaker boat cannot let fly one of their spinnaker sheets and let the sail flap out in front of the boat and call that crossing the line. Because that's not a normal position for a spinnaker to be in. But it would be the front of that spinnaker, if it was in normal position, crossing the line, that is the determining factor, not necessarily the bow. It could be equipment, which would be a sail, in their normal position. Touching a mark, we pretty much talked about that. One point, let's see, we talked about finishing. We got some examples. I think I went through those. Talked about the course. This is just a reminder from earlier that you don't have to round, you just have to leave. Other requirements. Okay, a few other requirements in part 4. Most of them we don't have to go through too much. Propulsion, I'll just mention, you can't use propulsion while racing, which means you can use it at your warning, but from your prep flag until You have cleared the finish line. You are no longer racing. You cannot use propulsion. You can have your engine on, but not engaged. Some people do that because they need power, electricity, whatever. So Rule 42, and you should go through the Part 4 rules just to be familiar with them, but they're usually not a problem. Rule 52 is manual power. You can't use electric winches. You have to use manual winches. Manual power, human power, has to power everything on the boat. So you can't use electric winches. There are exceptions to that there are some exceptions if you are short-handed and you have to talk to your race committee. For example, you cannot use an autopilot, but there are exceptions to that. You can use an autopilot if you're short-handed. So for example, one of our racers, Gene Stark, he races single-handed. If he wanted to use an autopilot while he was adjusting sails, he could say, I want to use my autopilot while I'm adjusting my sails, and that can be legal. But generally speaking, there are special cases there. So no electric winches, please. I'll get into penalties in a little. Safety matters. I mentioned you can help other people on other boats if they mutiny. There's also a rule that you have to finish the race with everybody on board that you started the race with. So if a crew mutinies and throws their skipper overboard because they didn't like the beer that he brought, they're not going to get credit. They're going to get disqualified, because not for throwing him overboard, but they're going to get disqualified because they didn't finish the race with everybody on board that they started out with. So you just you got to have everybody on board, whatever reason that might be. You can leave the boat. So if you get snagged in a lobster pot, you can leave the boat. You can go swimming. You can jump overboard. You can do all that. But before resuming sailing, everybody's got to be back on. So if another boat came in to help you and picked somebody up, you got to make sure that that person that got picked up by another boat gets back on your boat before you finish. I think just a note on sails and poles. I think I get to this later, but just a quick note to move things along here. Poles, whisker poles specifically, must be attached to the boat. You can't have a crew member holding one end of a whisker pole and holding it out. One end has to be attached to the sail, and the other one has to be attached to the boat.
And to the mast. It's got to be attached to the mast.
To the mast, to the mast, to the foremost mast if you're racing with multiple.
Yes.
To be precise, yeah, to the mast. Must be attached to the mast. That's a good point, actually, Vic, because you couldn't like hook it to a safety line, for example, or one of your poles. It's got to be attached to the mast. So penalties you take as soon as possible. It is actually a myth that you have to take a 360 if you touch a mark, or a 720 if you break one of the other rules. So if you break one of the major rules, port starboard, windward leeward, tacking in the zone, whatever it is, if you break one of those rules, you have to take 2 turns. It's not a 720. It's 1 turn, and a turn is defined as 1 tack and 1 jibe, which means if you're on the right head to wind, that could actually be a 270, and you could use that to your advantage. So touching a mark is 1 turn. The other rules is 2 turns, and we'll go over here. So say you're downwind, you're coming in downwind to a downwind mark here at the position 0, the initial position, light wind, current's coming, bumps you into your mark. You could jibe, turn this way, at A1, jibe, tack, and then go off on a reach, and you have not actually completed the full 360, but you have done 1 jibe and 1 tack, and you're off. You don't have to do that, which would be a full 360. So if you do touch a mark, especially in like this downwind case, be aware of that, because you can save a lot of time, because a turn is just a jibe and a tack. But you must jibe and you must tack. So that's, just to be clear, that is what defines a turn. If you had to do two, again, you probably would go around again, but you wouldn't do a full 720. You'd be doing whatever 720 minus 90 is, or something like that. So that's just to be real clear there.
2 tacks and 2 jibes?
2 tacks and 2 jibes.
That's 2
Or
turns.
for touching a mark, 1 tack and 1 jibe for touching a mark.
Oh, okay.
So touching a mark, it's 1 turn. For all other rules, it's 2 turns. That's what that is. Anchoring, you can anchor. So in the race last year where the wind just died and I was doing against a current and I was doing quite well, I had nice sail trim, but was actually going backwards. I could have thrown out the anchor. So anchoring is allowed, but you just have to recover the anchor before you continue the race. So if you are getting dragged backwards, you could in fact anchor until the situation changed, no problem. 47.2 is no throwing your skipper overboard. Changing sails. There is a definition, I'll let you guys read it, of what the difference is between a head sail or a spinnaker. Basically, it's a ratio of the width of the middle of the sail. But you are allowed a head sail and a spinnaker. There's no rule that says you can't have both. However, if you are sailing a spinnaker, you are not allowed to use a whisker pole on your jib. So if you've got a spinnaker up, you can't use, there are limits on what you can do with a whisker pole on your jib, but you can have both a head sail and a spinnaker up at the same time. And you can have them, you can have 2 head sails up or 2 spinnakers up, but only while changing sails. So only while you're replacing a sail. So you can put the new one up and then pull the old one down. You can't continue sailing with two up. Ballast, you can't move your ballast around while racing. So for example, you could not move water from a port tank to a starboard tank while racing. You gotta, what you got, you can move your crew anywhere you want, your crew around, but you can't move ballast while you're racing. And I mentioned manual power. Everything's got to be powered by the crew. No electric winches, no other kinds of electric gizmos. You know, in like the America's Cup, they sort of follow this. The grinders are generating hydraulic power that actually moves the sails, but they have electronically controlled valves to open or close those. But they've interpreted this rule that say, well, because the power to actually move the sails and the winches is being provided by the grinders, that's legal here, even though they've got an electric switch panel on the boat that's opening and closing valves. And trash disposal, one of my favorites actually, no more flipping beer bottle caps into the water. It's a disqualification. so you know, take your, remind your crew that are, you know, pop it open, flip it over from the old days. No. And if a boat sees another boat do that, they can flag them, fly the red flag. They can protest them, and they either have to go dive and get that thing back, or do a 2-turn. You know, the penalty for a breach may be less than disqualification. So, you know, it may be a scoring adjustment. They may get, you know, there's guidelines for that for the committee. Maybe 20% of all the boats, there's a 20% penalty on time or something. Or maybe they're seen and say, okay, and they take 2 turns, you know, but yeah, kind of serious. So again, kind of summarizing, a little longer than I planned, but port starboard, overlapped or clear ahead, windward, leeward, zone, the zone rules, position when the first boat hits the zone is the rights, avoid tacking in the zone, avoid racing boats if you're not racing, and no crashing. A few resources, just so you know. You've got the racing rules of sailing, of course, which everybody should have a copy of, and it's free to download as a PDF. You know, I emailed it to everybody, I think, pretty much. But you know, I keep a waterproof copy on board, and I make sure that the race committee has a waterproof copy on board. You can get them in different formats. The case book is good to have. It's huge. You probably don't want to print it. It's like 300 and something pages of special cases, but it is useful sometimes to just scan through it to see how they interpret these rules when this rule seemed to apply, but this rule seemed to apply. Oh yeah, but in that case, it's this. Another good book, Dave Perry. Dave Perry is very involved in the writing of the rules. He's on all the committees that helps write the rules and clarify them. So he's a good resource. So understanding the racing rules of sailing is good, but my favorite is his book, 100 Best Racing Rules and Quizzes. And so he sets up a situation, and he takes that situation and explains, okay, this was the situation, who had the right of way, you know, who broke what rule, and they're really interesting. You know, he has one which is, I'll just show you quick as an example.
What's going on here?
Quiz. So he had this, which is, okay, quiz question 29. Okay, so we're at a starting situation. These boats are on a pretty much beam reach, A and B, coming in along the starting line. They're on starboard, and ahead of them, boat C is almost motionless. They're close hauled into the wind, but they're basically stopped. They're really tight, maybe pinching, trying not to go over the line early, and so they are technically an obstruction, a boat that I mean, they're clear ahead of you of both A and B. They're clear ahead, so they have the right of way right now. C has the right of way because they're clear ahead, even though they're not moving, but they're clear ahead. So they have the right of way. They're an obstruction that you have to go around. Now, the windward boat, B, hails A and says, I want room to go around an obstruction, which is actually a rule in Rule 19, which I didn't go to, but you have to give boats room to get under the obstruction. Boat A says, nope, I don't have to. You know, I'm the inside boat. But there's an obstruction rule, 19.2. A says, no, I don't have to let you, and B has to swing over the top of C. So who was wrong? Well, it turns out that the leeward boat is guilty for breaking a rule. 19.2 and 19.2 says a right-of-way boat may choose to pass an obstruction on either side. And when overlapped, the outside boat shall give the inside boat room. So the inside boat is A there. A can choose. It wants to go below C or it wants to go above C. A is free to choose which side of the obstruction it's going to go on. And because it's the inside boat, it's the lower boat, it has rights. So, right. So, but it had to give B room. So anyway, L is penalized. I didn't go through Rule 19. The leeward boat is penalized. But anyway, so there's all kinds of pictures like this in the book with examples for each of the rules, and there's 100 quizzes, and they're really good. So so I just thought I'd point that out as a resource. And
Okay.
I will send you guys this. You know, I'll make this into like a PDF, and I'll send everybody that registered for the course the slides, so you have this stuff. U.S. Sailing's good because they also have an online version of Dave Perry's 100 Best Racing Rules and Quizzes, which is kind of cool, which is nice. And so, questions. One note: the flags here, we've seen a lot. If you follow any of the online Facebook sailing things, you'll see code flag Lima. That's the L flag there, code flag Lima. Up. All these flags are context sensitive. So the flags actually have multiple meanings depending on what your context is. So at the beginning of the slide presentation, I had this up because we're doing it remotely under quarantine. And if you're at anchor, if you are at anchor, this flag means you are quarantined. If you are racing, this flag means come within hail. So come within hailing distance. If you are at sea and you are moving, a signal between two boats with this flag means stop immediately. So, you know, their context, they have meanings. So in my first context, it meant we were under quarantine, and here we are doing this remotely. And in this one, it means come within hail and ask any questions.